Hello everybody, I'm back. I'm back with my whiteboard and I want to talk about what we wrote in our Global Monetary Conditions Monitor for May, which we published last week. Or rather, I want to talk about two parts of the monitor. First of all, the importance of credibility in monetary policy making. And secondly, talk about Argentina, which we included in the monitor for the first time last week. What I want to say something about is how do we forecast inflation based on our monetary indicators and on credibility. And I tried to explain this with this relatively simple equation. What we have here is a stylized version on the way we do inflation forecasting for the 26 countries we have in our Global Monetary Conditions Monitor. First of all, inflation 3 years ahead. What do we expect? What would be our best forecast for inflation over the coming 3 years? Well, first of all, let's start with our monetary indicator, MI. Our monetary indicator is calibrated such that when it's zero, it essentially tells us that the central bank will hit its inflation target down the line. So if this is zero, we need to add the inflation target. So the monetary indicator plus the inflation target essentially give us what will be inflation down the road given present monetary conditions. However, we also need to take into account future actions of the central banks, or rather expected future actions of the central bank. For example, Israel or New Zealand has very credible central banks. They are essentially conducting monetary policy in such a way that around 80-90% of the time they might hit their targets, or they will conduct monetary policy in such a way that it's likely that they will hit their inflation target. For them, what is important is really not present monetary conditions, but their inflation target. The inflation target tells us that if the central bank is credible and monetary conditions in some ways off, away from zero, then it would be rational to expect the central bank to adjust monetary conditions going forward. So in a simple version where inflation expectations is given by monetary conditions, it's all about monetary conditions. But if inflation expectations is given by the inflation target, that would imply that we have a high level of credibility. That is what we call theta, the credibility ratio. If the credibility ratio is 1, then we would see that inflation in 3 years' time would be equal to the inflation target, while monetary conditions would have no role, as this would be zero, so monetary conditions would have been unimportant. You could say our indicator, our publications wouldn't really be very interesting if all central banks were 100% credible, because then the best forecast for inflation in the future would simply be the inflation target. However, that's not the case for Argentina. In fact, Argentina has essentially just introduced an inflation target. They have never delivered their inflation target. Presently, they are having an inflation target for 2018 of 10%. At the moment, inflation is running at 40%. So we're way away from that. But let's say how we would forecast inflation for Argentina. Let's first look at the first case, in which is what we assume in our publication, and that is that theta is zero, that the Argentine central bank essentially has no credibility at all regarding its inflation target. In that sense, inflation in 3 years' time will be 0 times the 10-year inflation, 10% inflation target, plus 1 minus 0 times our monetary conditions, which is presently around 7%, plus the inflation target of 10%. What does that tell us? Well, that's 0 and that's 1. So that tells us that inflation in 3 years should be around 17%. And this is in fact more or less what we are forecasting in the Global Monetary Conditions Monitor. However, let's look at the example where we are gaining credibility. If you look at most forecasts for Argentine inflation conducted, for example, by the IMF and by the Argentine investors and so forth, they're talking about somewhat lower inflation in the coming years than 17% as we forecast. So what's the difference? Well, some are arguing that the efforts undertaken by the Argentine government to consolidate public finances will reduce the need for monetarization of public debt. We certainly agree with that, but we haven't really seen that as a sustainable path. But let's assume that it's happening. Let's also assume that the Argentine central bank continues to deliver. A way to illustrate the gains from gaining credibility could be to look at how do other central banks in Latin America do. A good example of a rather well-run central bank is the Mexican central bank. If we look at the credibility ratio as we have calculated for Banxico, the Mexican central bank, then it's actually around 0.5. If we have that, then this changes. What we then get is we get inflation in 3 years should be equal to 0.5 times the target of 10 plus 1 minus 0.5 times 7 plus 10. This down here is 17 times 0.1 is 8.5. And here 0.5 on 10, that is 5. That gives us inflation of 13.5 percentage points. That is essentially the expectation we should have for Argentine inflation 3 years ahead if the Argentine monetary regime was as credible as the Mexican monetary regime. So obviously we can see there's quite a bit difference between a non-credible and a somewhat credible monetary regime. What will be interesting going forward is whether the Argentine central bank will be able to gain credibility. The only way to gain credibility is to deliver on the target. Obviously, a key story in Argentina is public finances, as the government is still essentially monetizing part of its debt. There is what we call unpleasant monetarist arithmetic. If there is a large deficit, that will create expectations of money printing, and that of course will erode credibility. So Argentina is in a special situation compared to most other of the countries in our monitor, in the sense that Argentina to such a large extent has a fiscal issue that essentially dominates its monetary issue. So we would be looking at fiscal progress to consolidate public finances and to stop the monetization of public debt. If that happens, and it looks like we're moving in that direction, then it would be natural to give a higher credibility score to Argentina, and then inflation expectations would automatically drop. The question is, will the government in Argentina deliver on this? If they do, it will make life much easier for the Argentine central bank. For now, the credibility ratio for Argentina is 0. If it moves to Mexican levels, there are considerable gains to be had in terms of reducing inflation. It will be very interesting to follow that going forward. Thank you very much.